Welcome to the MU Extension Labor and Workforce Development Workforce Transitions webinar. My name is Amy Patillo, a specialist with the University of Missouri Extension and your moderator for today's webinar. It is my pleasure to introduce our speakers who will present information about mental health. It's okay to say no, leading with resilience. Our speakers are John Fuller, a 10-year Army veteran with a master's in social work from the University of Missouri. John is a human development and family science specialist with the University of Missouri Extension. Andrew Zumwalt, who is a certified financial planner, has a master's in consumer and family economics from the University of Missouri. Andrew is also an assistant extension professor in the Department of Personal Financial Planning at the University of Missouri. And our last speaker today is Marco Pantoja, a 9-year Marine Corps veteran who is an accredited financial counselor and has a master's in financial planning from the University of Missouri. Marco is also a personal finance extension instructor at the University of Missouri. Welcome, and we appreciate your time with us today. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Amy.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Let's go ahead and get started. So we're going to talk today about resilience, but it's useful to kind of step back from resilience and look at what is kind of the challenge to resilience. And so from the research, we know that there are several stresses in high-risk occupations. So things like isolation, being cut off if you're maybe working on an oil derrick or an oil rig in the middle of nowhere. Maybe you're there for several weeks and then you come back to wherever home is, and then you spend a week or two, and then you go back and spend several weeks back out in the wild. The internet can help with that, but sometimes the internet just makes that isolation more stark. We need to have that connection with people, being in the same room. Ambiguity, so a lot of uncertainty can cause stress. Ambiguity in your job or what's going to happen in the future. And that kind of goes along with this idea of powerlessness, feeling maybe stuck, feeling unable to control the future or control the present situation. Also boredom or alienation. And so I work with some soldiers down at Fort Leonard Wood who actually help their fellow soldiers prepare tax returns for them and for the veterans and retirees around the base. And they tell me that in the military, there's a strong prevalence of this idea of hurry up and wait, hurry up and wait. And that can lead sometimes to boredom as you hurry up and get there, but then you have this period of where you just have to wait for whatever the next step is. Another stressor is your workload. So working overtime, trying to meet ambitious goals, but really kind of verging on that burning out. And then there's the actual danger of working someplace. For example, danger of being harmed or hurt on like an oil rig, an oil derrick, or maybe it's in farming where the weather can change abruptly and cause problems, all sorts of stresses in high-risk occupations. Now, looking at our current situation, I never thought I would compare an oil rig to a grocery store. But we're starting to see that with the pandemic, a lot of these comparisons between these two. So the oil rig, kind of a dangerous place, isolation, ambiguity, all these issues. But I would suggest that the grocery store carries some of these kind of dangers as well, or stresses as well. And so when we look at COVID-19 stressors, researchers have been talking and writing papers about the perception of safety. What is safe anymore? A grocery store we thought was a pretty safe place, but we know that the interactions can sometimes spread the virus. And so we've got to have this social distancing, the masks, etc. But even still, we're seeing that some people are questioning, well, how good is a mask? Or should we put up plastic shields? You're starting to see more plastic shields at the checkouts. Quarantine and confinement, working from home. I started working from home about mid-March, a little bit later. And that was fun the first week. My wife also was working from home. We got to have lunch together. We took the dog on walks. It was great. And then the second week, I'm like, okay, this is okay. And the third week, it's like, well, all right, what are we doing here? Is this the future? And so we can be stressed when we're quarantined or working from home and not in our kind of normal environment. We can be stressed out kind of on the two ends of the spectrum of information overload versus the unknown, what we don't know. And so a great example of that is I think just this week, in the past week, we saw some news about people who are asymptomatic and spreading the virus. They said that that really wasn't a thing, and then they kind of walked that back. We've seen this also when we talk about what is safe anymore from the first bullet. Do we wear masks? Do we not wear masks? Are the masks helpful? Are they helpful for other people? We still have this huge amount of information that's kind of rolling around, and we're trying to figure out what do we need to know, type of thing. And also, we're seeing some issues of stigma. There was early on, this was kind of labeled the Chinese flu, and maybe there were certain people who were targeted because of their race, even though really that had nothing to do with it. The person maybe hadn't traveled at all, and so they were still targeted because of how they looked. And so we're starting to see some stresses coming out in the stigma. There was a hashtag on Twitter, hashtag boomer remover, and that's how they referred to COVID-19. And these generational divides, they just don't help. They hurt business, they hurt communities. And so a lot of people have been stressed out by not just the virus and the kind of these top bullets here, but even the issues that divide a community. And then there's also the financial loss and job insecurity. We've had a pretty high unemployment, and I believe the Federal Reserve came out yesterday and suggested that we will have 10% unemployment going into the fourth quarter of 2020. And so this recession that we find ourselves in, it's not going to be an immediate jump back. It's going to be a little bit of a longer haul to get back to 3.5% unemployment where we were. So Marco is going to talk a little bit more about that financial loss and how to kind of counteract that. And instead, I'm going to talk about how do you respond to this? How do you react to these stressors? Well, a great antidote is resilience. But when I think about resilience, sometimes I have a hard time figuring out, what is resilience? How can I really grasp what is resilience? And for me, I like to take resilience and supplement another word, and that's hardiness. When I think of hardiness, it definitely has a person, a hard worker, someone who is working through adversity, all these types of things. And so hardiness is easier for me to think about in terms of resilience. And so in looking at the research, kind of pulling together all the different publications on resilience, 3 common traits really stand out. And one is this staunch acceptance of reality. The second is belief that life is meaningful. And this is not a philosophy class, so don't worry. We're not going to get too deep into that. But there is some research that says the belief that life is meaningful is important. And finally, an uncanny ability to improvise. So let's dig into each one of these. So staunch acceptance of reality. So what does that mean? Well, when you think about resilience or hardiness, if you're not as happy with that resilience word, actually the people who are resilient, they're not the optimists and they're not the cynics. And there's some great examples from the Holocaust or POW experiences where there is the optimist who is in this situation as a prisoner or at a concentration camp, and they think, okay, we're going to get free at Thanksgiving, and then it doesn't happen. Okay, it's going to be the new year, and then it doesn't happen. It's going to be the turn of the seasons. It's spring. When spring hits, that's where we're going to get out of here, and then it doesn't happen. And then summertime, July 4th, doesn't happen, and then you're back to maybe Thanksgiving. And so what happens is that optimist, they get worn down, and that optimism just kind of gets ground down until they kind of lose hope a little bit. And so the person who's most resilient is generally someone who's cool, somewhat pessimistic, and has a sense of reality. So not the optimist, not the cynic, but somebody who is, as it says, they're sober, kind of down to earth, right? not the doom and gloom, not the best scenario, but someone who's looking at it with a sense of reality. What's really going on? And some questions to really ask yourself is, do I truly understand and accept the reality of my situation? Easy question for me to read off the screen, very hard to actually understand and think about and consider, because you have to really set aside all your confirmation biases. You can kind of see this in the stock market a little bit, where people were kind of holding on to this belief that the pandemic wasn't going to cause any troubles. It was just a blip and we were going to get past it. It was something that was going to happen in other countries. And then that was kind of the optimistic side. And then we saw from the cynic side, or the extreme pessimist, that the virus was going to upend everything. And you saw the dramatic fall in the stock market. And basically the credit markets were starting to really grind to a halt even. And so a realist, again, stepping back and being able to say, okay, we're going to have this pandemic, it's going to change things, but we're going to regroup, we're going to regather. And so being able to plan for what happens after, what does it really look like? That's kind of the power of someone who's a realist, who has a staunch acceptance of reality. So if we're going to boil it down into kind of one phrase, someone who has this is optimistic in vision, but they're realistic in the mission. So really working there to figure out how it's going to get done. Second is belief that life is meaningful. And I don't want to get into too deep the philosophy here, but this belief that life is meaningful and also supported by strongly held values. And so that person really, when life gets tough, they keep going. And I don't mean to refer to the Holocaust too often, but Viktor Frankl has an amazing book out, Man's Search for Meaning. And it is a great book. It's constantly on the Amazon Top 100. It has meaning for several years now. And he's got a phrase in here: we must never forget that we may also find meaning in life, even when confronted with a hopeless situation, when facing a fate that cannot be changed. So this is someone who was in a concentration camp and realized that they had to kind of look beyond a little bit. Not be optimistic, but work within the confines of where they are, but start looking for meaning in the present with an eye to the future. And really that second bullet there, build a bridge from the hardships of the present to a fuller and better future. So it's kind of a hope out of despair, but it's not an absolute hope. It's an idea that things are going to get better. And again, where do you take that from a business perspective? Well, you take it and bring it back to the vision and mission of your organization, right? Things are going to get better. And Viktor Frankl was one of the leaders or early visionaries in this movement that became positive psychology. And so there's actually a strong positive psychology coursework that looks at how to change your life and focus on the positive side of things. Try and find meaning in life where maybe you haven't really looked before. Now you may say, Andrew, this is great, but you're verging into that philosophy again. I would recommend you take a look at Johnson & Johnson. They have something they call the credo, and it is the guiding principles that were written over a half century ago. And it outlines their responsibilities to the client, to their customer, to their partners, and to their shareholders. It's absolutely meaningful. It shows their values. It's a great vision for their organization, and includes kind of a mission aspect as well of how they get to their vision. Finally, trait number 3, an uncanny ability to improvise. And so there's a fancy term, if you're looking for the term this weekend, when you go out and kind of bring it up in conversation, is bricolage, something constructed or created from a diverse range of available things. And so being able to adapt and take the resources that you have available, which may not be the ideal resources, but pulling them together into something that can help meet the needs of your current situation. So for a great example of this would be Walmart and natural disasters. Walmart realized that one of their most powerful or useful tools is logistics, right? Walmart is basically a logistics company. They take stuff from the manufacturers and bring them to the people. And so during natural disasters, they actually stage the trucks and other supplies that need to roll in after the natural disaster has passed and people are kind of rebuilding their lives. And so it would be perhaps easier for them to just say, oh, we'll come back in when everything is kind of back to normal, and then we'll resupply people. But instead, they've got the trucks waiting to just roll in. And I think another a great group that is able to improvise is that scrappy small business owner that adjusts nimbly to their situation. So I think of the restaurant that has carryout, and they've adapted to contactless service. If you think about the alcohol companies that manufacture alcohol, switching to hand sanitizer, right? So they're adjusting to their situation. They're not letting events happen to them. They're helping to react and be proactive in dealing with the events. So if we were going to sum up these 3 traits in one sentence, people with resilience or hardiness, whichever word you like, tend to interpret stressful and painful experiences as a normal aspect of existence, a part of life that is overall interesting and worthwhile. So again, it's not being stuck somewhere or feeling those stressors that we talked about in the high-risk occupations or the stressors of COVID-19. It's being there and then realizing that there's meaning in this work. There's meaning in the future. We're going to go on to something better. So not pure optimism and not pure pessimism or cynicism, but an idea that there is something to work towards, and that provides that resilience. The good news is that resilience can be learned. There is some research that some resilience traits are genetic, but in general, we can learn resilience. And so we can get it through training and experiences. And so there will be a lot of people who leave the COVID-19 era with the experience of dealing with this terrible pandemic. We can also have leaders that lead by example, and their workers can kind of follow their lead and pick up on resilience and different tools. There's also a social context. So if you're an organization that promotes resilience, then your employees, your staff, your others are going to pick up on that, and it's going to become a part of your culture. So let's look at some of the specific strategies for fostering resilience as leaders. So how can leaders foster resilience? One is provide leadership focused on that resilience. So again, we talked about that vision and mission, having an optimistic vision, so you know where you want to go and it looks good, but a realistic mission of how you get there. So not having let's say a goal for the first quarter of doubling your sales by or doubling your sales or tripling your sales in one quarter. That's an optimistic mission. It may not be doable, and so you're going to have harm in your organization if you set a unrealistic mission and it's just not attainable. So again, optimistic vision, but a realistic mission. So having that staunch view of what reality is. Frequent, open, and honest communications. So don't hide the bad news. COVID-19 has brought with it a lot of bad news, and good leaders, they don't hide it. They're open and honest with their employees. And people really value that honesty in times of change. If you've been honest with your employees or your clients in the past, they're going to look to you for support in the future, and they're really going to look to you for guidance. And that's kind of what keeps relationships, that's what keeps sales rolling, is this trust that can be built up over time, right? I say it easily, right? Don't hide the bad news. It's easy to say that sentence, but who likes delivering bad news? That's a very hard trait to be able to deliver the bad news and be open and honest. So it is not easy. It's easy to say, but it's not easy. And finally, elevate recognition for following the resilience mindset. So we just talked about being able to improvise, having that uncanny ability, staying cool-headed during the disaster, and maintaining a belief in the values or goals of the organization. So there's the 3 things we just talked about. And there's a picture on the screen here of Marshall Stewart, who is the Vice Chancellor for Extension. And as I was building this presentation and reflecting, I realized that these are the same traits that I see in my leadership from the University of Missouri. And so we actually have a meeting tomorrow with Marshall Stewart, and we've been meeting every 2 weeks. He's been very open. He's told us there's bad news at the University of Missouri. We are facing some dire budget situations. But people really value that he is honest with us about that and helping us figure out how we can help adapt. And so he's giving us the ability to kind of improvise and adjust to that situation. So we've actually seen this happen within our own organization. So how do we apply this to COVID-19 more specifically? Be quick to communicate steps to protect your workers. What are you going to do about masks or other personal protective equipment? What are the new strategies or new tactics for the workplace? Is it taking people's shifts and staggering them so that not everybody is at work at the same time to give people the social distancing? Those types of answers. Having a response ready when employees come with questions. So figure out what the questions are ahead of time and have that response at the ready. And if there's a question that you don't have a response to, respond quickly. Don't let it sit there. Don't let the employees fret about it. Get it back to them quickly, and then you build trust when you are open and honest with your employees. And I've got protecting workers or protecting employees. Clients would be the same way. Clients often depend on suppliers or other people in their networks for continuous operation. And so it extends not just to your own workers, but to your clients as well. Empower workers to help their situation. Again, we're talking about that ability to improvise. It's great to realize or understand that the best ideas don't all flow from the top. Many a time, your frontline workers are going to be the people who have the most experience in a changing situation. So being able to tap into their ideas and their suggestions and compare and contrast them with the situation going forward, that's going to give you a marked advantage out in the business place. It may seem like an odd time to provide training, but it's useful to, again, show leadership, show that there's a belief in the future, that there's meaning in the future, and it helps to reduce that stigma. It's easy to, during the pandemic, become cynical and say, you know what, we're just going to be stuck here. If you're an older person, just say, well, I'm just vulnerable. But training can help reduce that. How can we alleviate some of those issues that COVID-19 faces? What are some new procedures that we can train people on, especially working from home, that will help them do their job, that'll help them find meaning, that help them feel productive? So it may seem an odd time to provide training, but this is something that people need in times of uncertainty. So don't drop it just because it may be a little costly. So overall, this whole slide and really much of this presentation is staying true to the beliefs and values of your organization or your culture. You've taken so much time to build up a context, a culture. Make sure that even during a disaster, you stay true to that and you just don't drop it as something you just used in good times. It's really useful to focus on team building. We have COVID-19 driving this generational divide. We saw #BoomerRemover on Twitter. Some people said, well, let's look to Generation X for self-isolation because they don't like to mingle or don't like to network. People look to the boomers for hoarding things, and then the millennials were labeled for their selfishness. It's easy to look at a pandemic and start blaming different generations in our workforce and even among our clients. And really, you just don't want to go there. It just divides people. It creates resentment. You're going to hurt your productivity. You're going to hurt your business if people are constantly pulling out these stigmas and applying it to people. So instead of looking at these generational divides, start maybe talking about shared experiences. So how are families dealing with this? How are you dealing with it? And hearing from that person, that worker, or that client, and then comparing and contrasting it to another family, and then try and have some lessons learned from that. Everybody's had some sort of stay-at-home order. How did you deal with that? Maybe there's a general shortage of toilet paper, and so how did people react? Did they go to a friend's, or did they tap another family member? Did they buy it online? Did they come up with some other substitute? Right? There's ways to explore these shared experiences we've all had during the pandemic. And learn from them and kind of grow closer together. So, and that really goes to this culture of openness, having an open conversation, an open dialogue with your workers and your clients to have a better understanding of where they are. And if you can figure out where they are, then you can figure out, okay, what's the next step? How can I help that person? And some of this team building is also maybe relaxing some of the rules or guidelines and letting people self-organize into teams. Maybe there's a problem that has arisen because a supplier is unable to deliver a needed component. And so there are different people within your organization that understand kind of what maybe the part or product that is needed to finish your final good or service. And so letting them go out and find that necessity and bring it back into the company. So letting people, when they self-organize, they're using that uncanny ability to improvise to find the solution. And again, that's that sign of resilience that we're really looking for. Some final general COVID-19 ideas. Being nimble is very useful during this time of uncertainty. And so again, accelerating feedback. So feedback from your frontline worker who is maybe dealing with clients or dealing with suppliers and trying to figure out how to kind of fix their problem to make the business more productive or to make sure that goods and services flow uninterrupted to the client. But also accelerating feedback from your clients as well, going out to your client and saying, how are we doing? Are you getting everything you need from us? Are the services adequate or good? How can we better serve you? So being nimble and reacting quickly to that feedback. Many businesses will have to make cuts in their wages or in their overall expenses, but you want to cut judiciously. Be quick to communicate it. Again, that open, that honest experience, but avoid wholesale cuts. Cutting all of your professional development, it may save or solve your short-term problem, but you're going to see issues later on as people look to improve themselves, as they look to grow. And so when you're looking at cutting, be judicious and also consider the experience and expertise of your employees. Some of your employees may have a lot of experience, a lot of knowledge that it would be very costly to replace. And so don't just cut wildly or cut redundancy. Consider what's going to happen on the other side, right? Have an idea of what the future is going to look like. And finally, allow and recognize failure. We oftentimes have this stigma against failure. We don't want to fail. We don't like failure. We don't like to allow it or even recognize it. We try and hide our failures many times. But really, failure can give us the most valuable experience. It's where we learn maybe the most deep lessons in our business careers. And so we want to allow it and recognize it. We don't want to have failures, business level failures, but smaller failures. The great example is ice cream flavors, right? You want to try different ice cream flavors to figure out what your customers like and then sell those flavors, right? If you just sell vanilla and chocolate, you're going to sell ice cream, but are you going to capture the market like someone who is exploring wider combinations, right? So we need to allow and recognize small failures, and that is the antidote to our stagnation where we just offer the same thing all the time. So that's a larger look at kind of leadership and the stresses of the response to resiliency. And so now I'm going to toss it over to Marco, and he's going to look more at the financial aspects of resiliency.
Thanks, Andrew. So we're going to take a look at financial stress and resilience and how resilience can be help reduce financial stress. And what we see here on this first slide is a $100 bill with a nested Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And if you're not familiar with that, it's basically a model that says, we all have needs that we want to accomplish in our life and that we need to fulfill in our lives. So we have things like physiological needs for food and water, these are the basic needs. We need safety and security. And then from there, we move up to things like relationships. We need to have close friendships and love and things like that. And then at the very top, we have the personal achievements, basically self-actualization. This would be like creative works, hobbies, education, things like that. And the reason that I have it nested in this $100 bill is really to illustrate that money touches so many areas of our lives. And it could be argued, I think, that money touches all areas of our lives in one way or another. And so when you start, having financial difficulties due to unforeseen economic things, it can really have a huge effect. And it really starts eating away at the ability to obtain these needs that we all have. So with that, I'm going to move to the next slide and talk about financial stress. So one thing to keep in mind with financial stress is that it's a subjective experience. We all experience it differently based on our individual situations. We all have different backgrounds. We've all been through different things. We all know how to handle things differently. But when it comes to financial stress, it's looking at how does somebody perceive their ability to meet their expenses, their satisfaction with their financial condition, whether that's savings or investments or income, things like that, how they worry about debt. And when these things start to turn negative and are unable to be met, you find yourself in financial distress. And so contrary to physical health, when there's economic downturns, like the recession that Andrew talked about that the Federal Reserve is predicting, there tends to be really big mental health declines with that. Okay, and so part of the research says that, you know, with economic declines and maybe even layoffs and things like that, people have more time to turn to physical activity, or they're eating at home more instead of eating out, so they're eating better foods. And so physical fitness and things like that actually improves during economic downturns. But one thing that definitely does not is mental health. And so some of that is certainly tied to money, right? You have these extra perceived stressors that are coming in with the uncertainty about the future or how to handle financial problems. And these things all compound your other perceived issues. So next slide. So for employees, this is an important thing, and definitely for employers to keep in mind, right? So later on, we're going to talk about the physiological effects of stress. So I'm not going to go into that here, but there are some really well recorded effects for financial stress, in particular, financial stress on employees. And so when employees are under greater levels of financial stress, it affects them in several ways, including their job performance. So you would have decreased work satisfaction, decreased organizational commitment, and increased absenteeism. So more people are going to be, missing work, maybe to take care of personal finance problems or, mental health days or something like that. They're not going to, the job isn't going to be their priority, right? They're going to be looking at other things, and they're going to care less about maintaining that job. Then there's other harder to quantify outcomes, things like theft, right? Infighting between employees, sabotaging other employees, accidents, disability and workman's comp claims, substance abuse, and of course, if there's a toxic environment that's brewing, there's going to be employee loss. And that, as Andrew mentioned, can be really expensive to retrain, really well-trained employees and things like that. So with the next slide, there is an antidote to financial stress. There's things that people can do to really protect themselves. So good health, reliable income, and above average risk tolerance, those things do insulate, right? And unfortunately, though, these are not necessarily something that everyone can have and obtain or change, especially in an economic downturn. But there is a trait that can be fostered to help people fare better during challenging financial times, and that is resilience, as Andrew talked about. And Andrew was, hesitant to define it, so I'm going to go ahead and do that here as the ability to roll with the punches or to carry on despite life's challenges and setbacks. And that's really what we mean by resilience. Are you able to just keep on going even when things are setting you back? All right. So the next slide. With resilience, there are specific characteristics of a resilient mindset that have been found to help people face their challenges in lives. And Andrew already talked about a lot of these, so I'm just going to go a little bit more in detail about what we're thinking about here. And there's overlap between broad picture and personal finance, most certainly. So first we have positivity, right? So positive people view challenges as opportunities. They consistently use the lemons to make lemonade. They reframe situations positively and often use the expression, it could have been a lot worse when comparing their misfortune to others. They're also focused. So if they determine where they're headed in the future, and they stick to their goals so that life events and other barriers don't take them off track, right? They stick to their goals and they keep working with them however they can. And of course, you need flexibility with that because things are going to pop up and, maybe change your current plans and force you to do something else. And so flexible people are open to new and different options when faced with these uncertainties. They're also organized. So organized people set priorities and develop structured approaches to manage change as it comes. And then lastly is they're proactive. So proactive people work with change rather than defend against it. They accept it as inevitable and they try to figure out what the best way to manage it is. So these are resilience in general, but there are also things that can be done to foster financial resilience in particular. So financial resiliency is the ability to face financial challenges, and it's enhanced with financial resources such as savings, health insurance, and a good paying job, as you might have imagined. So those things, as I already said, we don't necessarily have control over all those. Savings, probably, maybe not health insurance, with layoffs and things like that, or the reliable income. Those can definitely put those in jeopardy. If your job is tied to your health insurance and you lose your job, well, that's out. But there are some other things that people can lean on to help them be financially resilient. And, go back real fast. And so one of those is human capital, okay? And so human capital is basically all the knowledge and skills and experiences and contacts and other personal qualities that people have to sell to potential employers. So personal health is part of the human capital because it affects your performance. So, physical fitness and basically networking and gaining skills, right? This all builds your own value in your personal self. And then in addition to that, we have social capital. And so that includes like support systems from family, friends, coworkers, neighbors, and others that might be able to provide financial assistance or emotional support during hard times. So on the next slide, we have some commonly recommended financial practices to help build financial resiliency. And these are especially important during a tough economy. So one thing is to maintain a low debt to income ratio. So monthly consumer debt payments should be 15% or less of monthly take-home pay. Next is maintain an emergency fund. And so the ideal amount of an emergency fund would be about 3 months. Ideally, it would be 6 months, but shooting for 3 is good. And so keeping that money, 3 months of expenses, locked away in a liquid savings account or something like that, something so that you can get to it very easily. A savings account, money market fund, or maybe a short-term CD, very short-term. You don't want your money locked out, or it's going to cost you something to get it. So keep that in mind. I personally recommend either a savings account or a checking account it's just for the emergency fund. Continuous education. So never consider your education or your job training as finished, right? Continue to develop new marketable skills. Take care of your health with good nutrition, exercise, hospital visits, things like that. And this all works to increase your human capital and remain employable in today's extremely competitive market. Purchasing life insurance. So you definitely want to protect dependents against loss of the breadwinner's income, and disability insurance possibly to provide continued income following an accident or illness. And then knowledge of financial topics. So if you increase your knowledge of financial topics, it'll help you make smarter decisions. And this is an area where employers might be able to assist their employees. Next. So employer assistance programs is one option that employers have for helping their workers and potentially offsetting some of the detrimental effects of financial stress. They can offer a financial education program or a financial wellness program as an employee benefit. Topics that employees are commonly interested in are money management. So these would be things like budgeting, saving, expense tracking, basic personal finance stuff. But also, more advanced things like retirement education. So how retirement accounts work, making decisions about investments and planning, things like that. Credit management is definitely a huge one. Debt reduction, debt elimination techniques, dealing with debt collectors, all these types of things. There's a lot of misinformation out there and a lot of different ways to handle problems. And so it can be a really stressful just thinking about how to manage debt on its own. Lastly, consumer protection. So how to avoid scams, consumer rights, fair debt collections practices, maybe dealing with identity theft, these types of things. So these are the main topics that people are generally interested in a financial wellness or financial education program. And so by increasing personal awareness and knowledge on these topics, people can feel better equipped to make decisions and handle challenges when they're faced with financial trouble. So we've talked a lot about stress and resilience, including COVID-19 challenges and what you as a leader can do, as well as additional financial considerations. But your ability to act on these may be compromised if you are overwhelmed with stress. And so with that, I'll turn it over to John, who will take this topic to a more individual level.
All right. Thank you, Marco. I sure do appreciate that. My name is John Fuller. I am a human development and family science specialist with the University of Missouri. And so I want to take a few minutes and talk about how we function in a stressful situation and what it means to make decisions during these times. Because we've talked about disasters, cleaning as we're returning some of the resources out there and some of these financial and business stresses that we're dealing with. So next. So let's imagine this coffee cup is your business. Next. And then one of these water bottles represents stress that is around us, okay? And as we come across these stressful situations, we start adding more water bottles, and they all got to go into this cup. And if you think about it, it's not long before we get to the top. We can adjust to those small little adjustments, but as it gets closer and it gets up there close to the top, our emotional part of our brain kicks in. That primitive part of our brain that says, hey, you've got to do something. I mean, we can fill these water bottles up with some of the most nastiest stuff in these water bottles. And as it gets closer and it's about to spill over, we'll drink from that cup just to protect our business. No matter how nasty it is or how awful it is, we're going to do whatever we can to protect us. And understand that, sometimes our employees, even though they bring those stresses, they don't want to bring that stress and add to the cup. They know they're adding to the cup and it adds to their own stress. So it's either becomes someone else's problem or reflects on the way that we start handling the situation. Plus you have more problems that are just waiting to go in the cup at some point, and you have to come up with devise a plan to address those needs. So the question then becomes, how do we deal with those stress and reduce the stress of the employees and are able to employees to come up with those solutions to some of those stresses? Because we have situations like, next slide. Then we have situations like COVID-19. Our brains go into those panic modes, just like most people would. There's a part of our brain that engages and takes over in these situations and tends to sometimes have illogical choices. It's because the emotional part of our brain is responsible for that fight, flight, or freeze. And it's only thinking one thing, and that's, how do I protect myself? And I think most of you can relate to that in a sense of, I was oriented a lot. Now I get this. What do I do? And when we're in that state, there's not a lot of rational thinking going on during these stages. We're doing anything we can to just survive. And it's during these times that we must recognize what's happening so that we become aware before we make a decision, because that part of the brain cannot make a logical decision. Next. And so what it does is, you ever been so stressed out? It's like you're living in a fog. You can't see clearly. And, what's happening is that as we become stressed, cortisol is released into our bodies. Cortisol is one of those stress hormones. And we're not able to think clearly when cortisol is released in our system, because it is just meant to get us out of the danger that we're facing. And but we do need cortisol, but large amounts of it is not good. And what happens is we get focused on that one situation and we lose sight of the whole forest around us because we're so determined to take care of this one solution. And so it's going to impact how we make decisions. So sometimes you're just going to have to take a deep breath and start retracing your steps, because that's one of the things that you can do to disengage that part of our brain, is to start thinking and start planning, because then that forces us to engage our prefrontal cortex, which is where our executive function is. That's where our best decisions are made. You ever made a decision and then all of a sudden later on you're like, oh, I shouldn't have done that? Well, that immediate response is that primitive part of your brain that's telling you we need to do something, and to get that instant gratification knowing that that's taken care of. Well, when that comes down, your prefrontal cortex kicks back in. It's like, what did we do that for? Because that's where the logic part of the brain thinks. And so we may repeat that process. Next. So how we deal with stress has long-term effects on our bodies. We learn to function to stress in a split second based on our past experiences. To give you an example, I was in the military. You're trained from the very beginning how to respond to a very real life and death situation. Why? Because no sane person would do some of the things required on the battlefield that we're asked to do. Your response is automatic, because if you reacted instead of responding, lives are at stake. In a way, we have trained our whole lives to deal with stress in our own ways, because we have learned to react. And because of that, we've developed some unhealthy habits that have long-term consequences. And the good news is that we can actually train our system to respond in a different way that has better outcomes. As you can see on the screen, based on which direction you go, can have different impacts. When we're constantly in that anxious, that fight, flight, or freeze state, we're starting to see hormones levels go up, like the cortisol and the adrenaline. Blood pressure rises, serotonin goes down, our immune system drops. We're not digesting like we should, and because we're reacting that way, now we start seeing high blood pressure, upset stomach, feeling irritated, headaches, and then we find negative ways to cope with that stress, and that's from just lack of sleep, overworking, just doing all kinds of different things. And in the long run, it's going to lead to long-term health effects, where if we're responding more and we start reducing some of those stress hormones, then we do that by becoming aware of our body sensations, when we're in that state, when we're making our decisions. It helps us stay in the moment, and we start looking at positive ways to cope with our stressors. And in the long run, hopefully it gives us a better outcome. So next. So knowing when to say no is more than telling someone else no. Sometimes we have to say no to ourselves at times, even when we feel that some things need to be done. As you've seen today, our irrational decision making can have severe consequences. No gives you time to think of your options. No trains your brain to respond to stress instead of reacting, or if you have to react. No may give you a chance to switch back to responding as soon as you can. And I'm not saying that you have to say no to everything. What I'm saying is that understanding where your response is coming from. If you're feeling anxious, nervous, upset, this may not be the time to be making those definite decisions. You do not have to have all the answers all the time, and may require a little more time to make a decision. Even if you make a snap decision, you have the ability to think about that decision and maybe modify your original decision. You may say, how do I learn to do that? Because I've seen it. Somebody wrote that no means you know your boundaries. So some of you are saying, John, that sounds great. All this sounds great. But, what can how do I do that? And, that could be like Andrew talked about and Marco talked about, just further in education, learning some different aspects. Or sometimes it takes even more, maybe a professional help of some sort, but just understanding how we're engaging when it comes to our decision making. And here at the University of Missouri, next, we actually have a program called Taking Care of You that we provide, and it's a multi-session. We present it in different formats, whatever is conducive for whoever's taking the class. And we kind of talk about how the brain functions, how it wires, why we do some of the things that we do when it comes to stress. And then we also start working on helping you with a toolbox to start regulating the stress in your life. Now, will stress go away? Absolutely not. We need some stress to function. But chronic stress is not what we're after. And so with that being said, I'll kind of wrap it up from there, just in case we have a few questions out there.